In this module, you will use input validation to show an error to the user if the firstName property of a customer is empty. The firstName property is defined in the Customer Item ViewModel class. In the customer's view, the text property of a text box is bound to that firstName property. Input validation in WPF is part of a two-way data binding like we have it here. When this data binding writes the value from the text box back to the firstName property, the data binding can validate the user input. To do this, you implement the validation logic in the Customer Item ViewModel class that contains the bound firstName property. To implement the validation logic, WPF supports different approaches. The first approach are exceptions. You can throw an exception in the setter of the firstName property if the input is invalid. On the data binding, you need to set the validates_on_exceptions property to true so that the data binding will add the error to the user interface. The next approach is to implement the IDataErrorInfo interface on the Customer Item ViewModel. When you use this interface, you have to set the validates_on_dataErrors property on the data binding to true. A more modern approach than these two is to implement the INotifyDataErrorInfo interface on the Customer Item ViewModel. With this interface, you don't have to set any property on the data binding because this validation approach is used by default. You could explicitly set the data binding's validates_on_notifyDataErrors property to true. But as mentioned, this property is true by default. Now, the last approach for input validation is to add a custom validation rule to the data binding's validation rules property. Actually, all the other approaches are adding such a validation rule behind the scenes. From all these approaches, I recommend that you use the INotifyDataErrorInfo interface. It is not only the most modern approach, it is also the most powerful and most flexible approach. This is because it supports multiple errors per property, and it also supports asynchronous input validation with an errors changed event. In this module, you will learn how to implement this interface to add input validation to our WPF application. Let me show you the plan with this interface in the next clip.